But perhaps the most unsettling part of biblical prophecy is not the wars themselves, it is what happens to humanity during them. Because throughout Scripture, conflict is never described as only physical destruction. It also reveals spiritual condition. Wars expose fear. Fear exposes desperation. And desperation changes people. That is why periods of global instability often become moments of spiritual awakening, but also moments of spiritual deception, because when people become afraid, they search for answers quickly, and not every answer leads toward truth. The Bible repeatedly warns about false voices rising during times of confusion, voices promising certainty, voices promising safety, voices claiming to understand exactly what is happening. And history shows this pattern clearly. Whenever societies become unstable, people become vulnerable to manipulation. Fear weakens discernment. And uncertainty makes people willing to follow almost anyone who sounds confident. That is why biblical prophecy often connects chaos with deception. Not simply because disasters happen, but because confusion changes how people think. And perhaps that is exactly what many people sense happening today. Information everywhere. Fear everywhere. Fear everywhere. But clarity harder to find. People no longer know who to trust. Governments conflict with one another. Media narratives constantly shift. Social media amplifies anger every second. Truth itself feels increasingly fragmented. The Bible warned about this kind of confusion long before modern technology ever existed. A time when many voices would compete for influence. A time when deception would become difficult to recognize. And perhaps the most dangerous part is this: deception rarely appears obvious. It often looks convincing, reasonable, comforting, and that is why so many biblical warnings emphasize discernment, the ability to recognize truth even during chaos. Because in unstable times, people naturally drift toward extremes. Fear creates panic. Panic creates irrational decisions. And irrational decisions create even more instability. This cycle repeats throughout history again and again. But the Bible presents another perspective entirely. It teaches that external chaos should not control internal direction, that even when nations shake, people must remain spiritually grounded, and perhaps that message feels more difficult today than ever before. Because modern life is built around constant stimulation, constant updates, constant fear. People wake up to conflict and fall asleep to conflict. The mind never rests. And slowly, anxiety becomes normal. But the Bible repeatedly warns against living consumed by fear. Not because danger is imaginary, but because fear itself becomes destructive when it controls people completely. Fear clouds judgment. Fear destroys peace. Fear weakens hope. And hopeless societies become unstable societies. That is why many prophetic passages include both warning and reassurance. Yes, difficult times would come. Yes, nations would struggle. Yes, humanity would experience periods of darkness. But the message was never simply, be afraid. The deeper message was, stay awake spiritually. Because according to Scripture, spiritual blindness becomes one of the greatest dangers during chaotic periods. People become distracted, consumed by survival, consumed by outrage, consumed by temporary struggles, and eventually, they stop asking deeper questions about truth, morality, and meaning. That is why so many biblical prophecies focus not only on events, but on human behavior. Because behavior reveals spiritual condition. And perhaps that is why many people today feel emotionally exhausted. The modern world moves faster than human beings were designed to process. Endless conflict, endless noise, endless division. And over time, people become numb. The Bible described this too. A world where hearts grow cold, where empathy decreases, where selfishness increases. And perhaps the most chilling part is how normal this begins to feel. People adapt to conflict, adapt to outrage, adapt to instability, until eventually, chaos becomes ordinary. But Scripture repeatedly warns humanity not to lose its moral and spiritual direction during these moments. Because civilizations rarely collapse all at once. Collapse usually begins internally first. Truth weakens. Morality weakens. Trust weakens. And eventually, society itself begins fracturing. This pattern appears throughout ancient history. And many people fear they are watching similar patterns emerge again now. Not necessarily because the world is ending tomorrow, but because humanity appears increasingly divided against itself, and division weakens societies. That is why one of the strongest themes throughout biblical prophecy is unity rooted in truth. Not forced unity, not political unity, but spiritual awareness, compassion, wisdom, discernment, because without those things, fear takes control, and fear-driven societies become dangerous. History proves this repeatedly. When people panic, they stop thinking clearly. When people lose hope, they become vulnerable. And when truth disappears, manipulation spreads easily. Perhaps that is why the Bible places such importance on remaining spiritually awake during uncertain times. Not obsessed with predicting every event. But focused on understanding the condition of humanity itself. Because prophecy is not only about what happens externally, it is about what happens internally. What fear does to people, what power does to people, what hopelessness does to people. And maybe that is why these ancient passages continue feeling so emotionally powerful today. Because despite modern technology, human nature has not changed. Humanity still struggles with fear, still struggles with greed, still struggles with power and division. And perhaps that is the deeper warning hidden beneath all biblical prophecy. Not merely that wars would happen, but that humanity would continue repeating destructive cycles unless something changed spiritually. And maybe that is why so many people today feel drawn back toward faith, Scripture, and spiritual questions. Because when the world feels unstable, people search for something stable, something eternal, something beyond politics, economies, and headlines. And the Bible consistently points toward one idea: human systems fail, human power changes, empires collapse, but truth remains. Perhaps that is why these ancient prophecies still survive thousands of years later, because they are not only describing events, they are describing humanity itself, its fears, its weaknesses, its cycles, and its constant search for meaning during uncertain times. So as wars continue, as division spreads, and as fear grows across the world, the deeper question may not simply be, what happens next? But rather, what kind of people will humanity become during it? Because according to Scripture, that answer matters just as much as the events themselves.